I'm John McKee, editor of Messianic Apologetics, messianicapologetics.net. And I would like to welcome you to this episode of Messianic Insider, your theology and news roundup for February the 3rd, 2026. We do have a lot of very important, I believe, news to go through later in our live stream, particularly as it involves the ongoing tensions in the Middle East and what is going to take place or not take place regarding Iran. Now, we have been going through a multi-part series on our theology roundup, Romans 9, 10, and 11. And of course, the main reason why we've been going through this is not only is it central to understanding the Messianic mission, the end-time salvation of Israel and the Jewish people, but also we are in a season of rising anti-Semitism, rising anti-Zionism. Many people who claim to know Israel's Messiah do not have the same heart for the people of Israel as a figure like the Apostle Paul. Okay, so our study is taken from our ministry's commentary, Romans for the Practical Messianic, recently updated at the end of 2025, as indicated by the blue and green cover. You can check it out at messianictheology.store, available in both paperback as well as ebook. All right, so let me switch windows really quickly, and then we can get into our study. All right, so there we go. Today we're going to be reviewing Romans 11, 22 through 25. Behold, then, the kindness and severity of God. Toward those who fell, severity, but toward you, God's kindness. If you continue in his kindness, otherwise you also will be cut off. And they also, if they do not continue in their unbelief, will be grafted in, for God is able to graft them in again. For if you were cut off from that which is by nature a wild olive tree, and were grafted contrary to nature into a cultivated olive tree, how much more will these who are the natural branches be grafted into their own olive tree? Messianic Apologetics, Revised Version, which, as I've noted throughout the study, it has been adapted from the public domain World Messianic Bible. All right. Romans 11, 22 through 24. As Paul observed, behold then the kindness and severity of God. To those who fell, severity, but to you, God's kindness. If you continue in his kindness, otherwise you also will be cut off. Romans 11, 22, New American Standard. A reader might need to be reminded of Paul's thought in 2 Corinthians 13, 5. Examine your own selves, whether you are in the faith. Test your own selves. Or don't you know about your own selves that Yeshua the Messiah is in you, unless indeed you are disqualified? World Messianic Bible. The only major way that the natural Jewish branches can be grafted back in to their olive tree, Romans 11, 23 to 24, is for the wild branches to truly understand and demonstrate God's kindness and grace in Yeshua to them, Romans 11, 31. Unfortunately, for far too many throughout religious history since the 1st century CE, what Paul intended was never truly attempted. Craig S. Keener observes in the book Awakening the One New Man, quote, Paul's vision of Gentile believers provoking Israel's turn to the Messiah did not fail in principle. It was never simply tried the way Paul articulated it. Paul's appeal to Israel involved repentant Gentiles turning to the God and Messiah of Israel. What arose instead was a Gentile church that conveniently forgot from whom they learned about God and the Messiah. Note that Paul wrote to Gentiles grafted in as wild branches to the olive tree. Do not be arrogant against the natural branches. God could graft back in the fallen natural branches more easily than he grafted you in to begin with. Moreover, if you are arrogant, God can cut you off as he cut off the natural branches. See Romans 11:17-24. What Paul warned Gentiles against doing is precisely what subsequent generations proceeded to do, ignoring his warning. Unquote. Obviously, our eternal God, as the master arborist, is the only one for certain who knows those who have been decisively cut off from Israel's olive tree. The direction for non-Jewish believers is to maintain yourself in God's kindness. Complete Jewish Bible. Romans 11:16-22 is quite important for today's broad Messianic movement, not only for non-Jewish believers being grafted in as wild olive branches, but most especially also for new Jewish believers being grafted back in as natural olive branches. How these concepts inform discussions of ecclesiology among some in today's Messianic Judaism needs to be recognized. David H. Stern makes some keen remarks on Romans 11:18 previously. Don't boast as if you were better than the branches. However, if you do boast, remember that you are not supporting the root is supporting you. Complete Jewish Bible. He summarizes in his Jewish New Testament commentary, quote, to make Shaul's point as clear as it can be, whether the root is Avraham, the patriarchs, the Messianic Jews, or all the Jews, see verse 16, it is a Jewish root, and don't you forget it. Notice that Shaul is reminding Gentile Christians that trusting God also means joining God's people. It is no different now than it was with Ruth. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Ruth 1:16. Gentile Christians have joined Israel, not the reverse. For a Gentile Christian to look down on the people he has joined is not only chutzpah and ingratitude, but also self-hate. Unquote. From the Jewish New Testament commentary. Not surprisingly, Stern makes some negative statements against replacement theology in his evaluation of Romans 11:19-24, and how it has been responsible for anti-Semitism throughout Christian history, and about the problems of dispensationalism and how it rigidly divides God's people too much into widely unrelated spheres. At the same time, stating the importance of the olive tree discussion in Romans 11:17-24, Stern is forced to recognize the importance of an olive tree theology for contemporary Messiah followers, but one which still needs to be developed a great deal. Quote, the olive tree analogy of verses 17-24 casts new light on the important theological question. Who are God's people? The most common theology in non-Messianic Judaism would answer this question: the Jews. The most common theology in Christendom answers: the church. But from the olive tree, we learned that there are three distinct groups at present who are all, in some sense, part of God's people, and no proper theology can ignore any of them. Number one, the Messianic Jews, who are the natural branches that are part of the cultivated olive tree. Two, Gentile Christians, the wild olive branches which have been grafted into the cultivated olive tree. Three, non-Messianic Jews, the natural branches which have fallen off the cultivated olive tree, but can easily be grafted back in again. What I call olive tree theology must take into account all three groups, all three kinds of branches in defining and describing the past, present, and future of God's people. Let theology picture God as a juggler. Traditional Jewish theology sees God as throwing one ball into the air, the Jews. Christian replacement theology sees him as having thrown the Jewish ball into the air in the past, but now he has let it fall and is juggling the Christian ball. To covenant theology and dispensationalism see God as somewhat more coordinated. He can juggle two balls at a time, both the Jews and the Christians. But only olive tree theology credits God with being able to juggle all three balls at once, Gentile Christians, Messianic Jews, and non-Messianic Jews, without letting any of them drop to the ground. At this point, olive tree theology is relatively undeveloped, but it is in ferment. Theologians are proposing solutions to the problem of who is God's people that include all three groups and allow for both universal personal salvation and Jewish national salvation only through Yeshua, although no one of these solutions is widely known and taught. Unquote. And once again, this is from the Jewish New Testament commentary. One of the main reasons why there continues to be an amount of tension present in various sectors of the Messianic movement when the subject of olive tree theology is brought up is because it requires one to recognize the stark reality that there are going to be some natural branches which will be permanently broken off of the tree. This means that there are going to be Jewish people to be regarded as unredeemed and consigned to eternal punishment, presumably along with those from the wild olive tree of the nations at large who were not grafted in. Likewise, for those wild olive branches grafted into Israel's olive tree, to what tangible degree does it mean that they have become fellow citizens and heirs? Ephesians 3:6, along with the natural olive branches not broken off. It should be noted that even with some limitations, Russell L. Resnick can still properly acknowledge in his book, The Root and the Branches, Jewish Identity and Messiah, how the olive tree represents a kingdom of Israel enlarged to welcome in the righteous from the nations. He even observes how this does not constitute an obliteration of the Jewish people. Quote, Paul dealt in depth with this issue, the people of God, in Romans 11, where he portrays the people of God as an olive tree made up of Jewish and Gentile branches. In Paul's vision, there is one people of God and one ultimate purpose for Israel and the church and Messiah. Israel is not obliterated, but is expanded to embrace all who become children of God through faith in Messiah. Unquote. From Russell Resnick's book, The Root and the Branches. At least with this quote, the only issue I would take is that an expanded kingdom of Israel does not manifest itself in the expanded component being known as the church. The expanded component is simply the righteous from the nations as co-heirs with the Jewish people. These people are obviously going to have their own ethnic and cultural distinctions to many degrees, and they should not at all anticipate a tribal inheritance in the land of Israel. But they will also bear a significant degree of commonality to their Jewish brothers and sisters as they worship and serve the God of Israel together and co-labor together in heralding the kingdom. Paul asserted the reality, and they also, if they do not continue in their unbelief, will be grafted in, for God is able to graft them in again. Romans 11:23, New American Standard. Jewish people who have been severed from their own tree can be grafted back in. And this is something which non-Jewish believers are to definitely work toward as a way to hasten the return of the Messiah. Paul's warning to the non-Jewish believers about being arrogant toward the natural branches, Romans 11:18, can only be remedied by wild branches from the nations taking a great concern for the well-being of the natural branches of the Jewish people. The engrafting of the natural branches back onto their own tree is actually observed by Paul to be something easier than grafting wild branches onto the tree. What this apparently means is that when Jewish people truly get the ramifications of the good news or gospel and receive Yeshua into their lives, that their redemption can often be easier than the redemption of people from the nations at large. While true of first century Jewish believers, to be sure, it can even be true of various 20th and 21st century Jewish believers as well. As Paul asserted in Romans 11:24, for if you were cut out of that which by nature is a wild olive tree, and grafted contrary to nature into a cultivated olive tree, how much more will these natural branches be grafted into their own olive tree? Tree of Life version. Not to be overlooked are some slight differences in the verbs rendered as broken off, Romans 11:17, 19:20, and cut off, Romans 11:22, 24. The natural olive branches, those of the Jewish people, are said to have been broken off. This is a very serious negative action, as eklao means to separate something from something with force, break off, from the BDAG lexicon. However, whether it is the wild olive branches, those from the nations, being taken away from their previous olive tree, or being threatened with being removed from the tree they are grafted into, they are said to have been cut off. This is actually an even more serious action, as ekopto means to cut so as to sever, cut off or down, or to do away with, exterminate, from the BDAG lexicon. While the wild olive branches being cut off from a worthless, relatively dead tree of the sinful world is a good thing, Romans 11:24, being cut off from Israel's olive tree after being grafted in is a bad thing, Romans 11:22. The main purpose of the Apostle Paul describing non-Jewish believers being grafted in to Israel's olive tree obviously does have a major component of ecclesiology to it, but it was specifically intended to stop any non-Jewish arrogance toward Jewish rejection of Yeshua, and included the threat of such people being cut off from the tree. If non-Jewish believers are indeed grafted into Israel's olive tree as wild branches and are experiencing the blessings intended for natural branches, should this not cause the natural branches, having been broken off, to be jealous? Romans 11:11. This is entirely contingent on the proper behavior of the wild branches. Romans 11:17 and 18. As Paul observed, behold then the kindness and severity of God. To those who fell, severity, but to you, God's kindness, if you continue in his kindness. Otherwise, you also will be cut off. Romans 11:22, New American Standard. The only way the natural Jewish branches can be grafted back in to their olive tree, Romans 11:23 and 24, is for the wild branches to demonstrate God's kindness and grace in Yeshua to them, Romans 11:31. Unfortunately, for far too many throughout religious history since the first century CE, what Paul intended was never truly attempted. It is probably safe to say, looking forward to additional developments in Messianic ecclesiology and Romans 11:16 through 24, that there will be some leaders and teachers who will be elusive about what it means for non-Jews to be grafted in, and then others who will be somewhat assertive about the olive tree representing the restored kingdom of Israel and Messiah with mixed natural and wild branches. Why there will be some elusiveness might have less to do with non-Jewish believers who have recognized Israel's Messiah being grafted in as wild olive branches, and even Jewish believers being grafted in as natural olive branches. It likely has to do with how there will be natural branches of Israel's olive tree which remain permanently broken off because of unbelief. This is why Paul was so insistent that those of the wild olive branches, non-Jewish believers, not become arrogant. Not only has it been a considerable challenge, and in far too many cases, near impossibility, to see Christians throughout history not harboring arrogance toward Jews who have rejected Yeshua, it can even be a challenge today to see non-Jewish Messianic persons from not having some degree of arrogance toward Jewish people, even Messianic Jews. All right, now we're not going to address all of these verses here. We're just going to be addressing Romans 11:25. So we'll have to come back to this tomorrow with our final session of our teaching here. So Romans 11:25. For I do not want you to be ignorant, brothers and sisters, of this mystery, so that you will not be wise in your own estimation, that a partial hardening has happened to Israel until the fullness of the nations has come in. Messianic Apologetics, Revised Version, which is, once again, adapted from the public domain World Messianic Bible. Okay, so Romans 11:25, and once again, we'll pick up with the rest of the verses tomorrow. One of the most important passages of the New Testament for generally all of today's Messianic movement is understandably Romans chapters 9 through 11. To review, in this vignette, the Apostle Paul expressed some of his deep anxiety and concern for his fellow Jews, who by this time in the mid-1st century CE appeared to have been widely rejecting Yeshua as Savior. In communicating to the Roman believers, whom he was preparing to visit, he emoted many of his concerns for the salvation of his fellow kinsfolk, rightly recognizing how God was not at all finished with them, but also how the good news had been widely embraced by those from the nations for some divine purpose. Romans chapters 9 through 11 speak very salvation historical, as Tanakh passages from the history of ancient Israel are appealed to. Within this absolutely loaded section of text, Paul stated something very poignantly to the non-Jewish believers in Rome, many of whom ran the serious and absolutely deplorable and condemnable risk of gloating over the wide-scale Jewish non-acceptance of Yeshua. Paul warned them to be quite sober, careful, and aware of the negative potential of what many of them were thinking. Paul issued the directive, "For I do not want you, brethren, to be ignorant of this mystery, lest you be wise in your own eyes, that a partial hardening has come upon Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in." Romans 11:25. This section of Paul's letter, Romans 11:25 to 29, to the end of chapter 11, has an important salvation history trajectory to it. All Israel will be saved. Romans 11:26. No one in today's broad Messianic movement denies that involved with this will be a significant salvation of the Jewish people in the last days, which we have already started to witness via the presence of the modern Messianic Jewish movement. And writing to the non-Jewish believers in Rome, Paul urged them not to be wise in your own conceits. King James Version. This is because Israel had been hardened until a point in the future when the fullness of the nations has entered in. Much of what is to take place, he notably labeled as a mystery, which might require some unconventional or at least uncustomary thinking on the part of various readers and interpreters. The fact that Romans 11:25 is labeled a mystery or mysterion is important to recognize, given how other mysteries appear elsewhere in Scripture. The dream of King Nebuchadnezzar revealed to Daniel was a mystery. Daniel 2:18-29. Yeshua's incarnation is a mystery. 1 Timothy 3:16. The summing up of all things in Messiah is a mystery. Ephesians 1:9-10. The equal inclusion of Jewish and non-Jewish believers in the ecclesia is a mystery. Ephesians 3:3-6. The change anticipated at the resurrection of the dead is a mystery. 1 Corinthians 15:51. Certainly to be aware of from a chronological standpoint is that all Israel will be saved. Romans 11:26, not occurring until the fullness of the Gentiles comes in. Green's fullness of the nations comes in, Green's literal version, is often thought to be a reversal of what is depicted in both the Tanakh or Old Testament as well as in ancient Jewish literature. What is widely depicted is instead a massive salvation or renewal of Israel proper, and then the nations at large recognizing Israel's God and being incorporated into the kingdom. A selection of passages from the Tanakh, Apocrypha, and Pseudepigrapha is worth noting. So, as I said here, what you frequently, naturally take from different anticipations in the Tanakh, Pseudepigrapha, is that there's going to be a massive salvation of Israel, and then the knowledge of the one God of Israel will go out to the world, and they will be incorporated into the kingdom. Is that what you see depicted in Romans 11? But let's review some of these passages. It shall happen in the latter days that the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established on the top of the mountains and shall be raised above the hills, and all nations shall flow to it. Many people shall go and say, Come, let's go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, and he will teach us of his ways, and we will walk in his paths. For the law shall go out of Zion, and the Lord's word from Jerusalem. Isaiah 2:2-3, World Messianic Bible. Many nations will go and say, excuse me, Come, let's go up to the mountain of the Lord and to the house of the God of Jacob, and he will teach us of his ways, and we will walk in his paths. For the law will go out of Zion, and the Lord's word from Jerusalem. Micah 4:2, World Messianic Bible. Many nations shall join themselves to the Lord in that day, and shall be my people, and I will dwell among them, and you shall know that the Lord of hosts has sent me to you. Zechariah 2:11, World Messianic Bible. It will happen that everyone who is left of all the nations that came against Jerusalem will go up from year to year to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, and to keep the Feast of Booths. Zechariah 14:16, World Messianic Bible. Many nations will come from afar to the name of the Lord God, bearing gifts in their hands, gifts for the King of heaven. Generations of generations will give you joyful praise. Tobit 13:11, Revised Standard Version. Then all the Gentiles will turn to fear the Lord God in truth and will bury their idols. All the Gentiles will praise the Lord, and his people will give thanks to God, and the Lord will exalt his people. And all who love the Lord God in truth and righteousness will rejoice, showing mercy to our brethren. Tobit 14:6-7, Revised Standard Version. The Lord himself is his kind, the hope of the one who has a strong hope in God. He shall be compassionate to all the nations who reverently stand before him. Psalms of Solomon 17:34. That's from the Pseudepigrapha. The rest are all Pseudepigrapha. And thereafter the Lord himself will arise upon you, the light of righteousness with healing and compassion in his wings. He will liberate every captive of the sons of men from Beliar, and every spirit of error will be trampled down. He will turn all nations to being zealous for him. Testament of Zebulun 9:8. And then the last one. But in your allotted place will be the temple of God, and the latter temple will exceed the former in glory. The 12 tribes shall be gathered there, and all the nations, until such time as the Most High shall send forth his salvation through the ministration of the unique prophet. Testament of Benjamin 9:2. Excuse me. In the estimation of Douglas J. Moo, quote, some Old Testament and Jewish texts predict that Gentiles will join the worship of the Lord in the last day, and some of them suggest that it is the Lord's glory revealed in a rejuvenated and regathered Israel that will stimulate Gentiles' interest. But wholly novel was the idea that the inauguration of the eschatological age would involve setting aside the majority of Jews while Gentiles streamed in to enjoy the blessings of salvation, and that only when that stream had been exhausted would Israel as a whole experience these blessings. Unquote. It is a slight challenge, especially when one considers the tenor of Peter's dynamic preaching in Acts chapters 2 and 3, to think that a big part of the mystery involving the salvation of the nations is how the entry of some group from the nations will eventually culminate in Israel's total redemption. For those who have a high view of Scripture and who believe in the literal restoration of the Jewish people to the Holy Land and fulfillment of the various prophetic words above, which I've just quoted, it is not as though these prophecies are not going to take place. Yet, what began with the redemption of Israel proper in the early first century resulted in a wide scale Jewish rejection of Yeshua of Nazareth by the mid first century. Only a remnant of Paul's own people recognized Yeshua, but this was not something inconsistent with past biblical history, Romans 11, 3-5. So, with the expectation of Israel's kingdom being fully restored still on the horizon, Acts 1:6, a mystery of the nations coming in, who were doubtlessly receiving Israel's Messiah en masse, had to be weighed by Paul into the equation. Paul's intention in Romans 11, 25-29 following, was to get the non-Jewish believers in Rome off of any anti-Jewish or anti-Semitic ideas they may have been harboring because of the widespread Jewish rejection of Yeshua. He wanted them to recognize the mystery to unfold with a selection of unique renderings offered for Hina me eta par healtois phronimoi, lest ye should be wise in your own conceits, King James Version, so that you may not be complacent about your own discernment, New English Bible, lest you become unduly self-satisfied, God's New Covenant by Cassirer. You mustn't get the wrong idea and think too much of yourselves, Kingdom New Testament. It is already to be observed that the breaking off of natural branches from the Jewish people has enabled there to be room made for wild branches from the nations, Romans 11, 17-18, thus causing non-Jewish believers to benefit from the error made by Paul's fellow Jews in rejecting Messiah. But rather than be haughty or self-righteous over this dilemma, such non-Jewish believers were to recognize their critical role to play in the corporate salvation of the Jewish people, and indeed the consummation of the Messianic kingdom itself. A reader of Romans 11:25 needs to be aware that there are value judgments present among English versions over how to render hauti porosis apa merus to Israel gegonen, which the Brown and Comfort interlinear presents as that hardness in part to Israel has happened. Most notable would be the different renderings, such as a partial hardening has happened to Israel, New American Standard, versus a hardening has come upon part of Israel, Revised Standard Version, New Revised Standard. The Complete Jewish Bible has, it is that stoniness to a degree that has come upon Israel. Much of this comes down to whether meros, a part or share, the Liddell Scott lexicon, is approached as a straight noun or is approached adverbially. James D.G. Dunn details how the adverbial approach to meros is imperative because it conveys the point of how Paul was concerned with the total redemption of his whole people and not just individuals here and there. Quote, as in its other occurrences in Paul, apa merus should be taken adverbially, that is, with porosis rather than Israel, so that partial hardening or blindness rather than part of Israel. Also 15:15, 2 Corinthians 1:14, 2:5. It is not unimportant that Paul still retains a concept of Israel as a unified whole, the people suffering partial blindness rather than only part of the people suffering blindness. Even in his criticism of his people, Paul still feels himself to be part of a single people, unquote. A partial hardening will presumably persist upon Paul's Jewish people until a future point in time, labeled by him as akri u ta pleroma ton ethnon eselthe, until the fullness of the nations comes in. Kingdom New Testament. In contemporary examination, there has been an overwhelming dominance of Calvinistic exegesis on this clause. Reflected in the Common English translation, one will encounter of ta pleroma ton ethnon, the full number of the Gentiles. Revised Standard Version, New Revised Standard, English Standard Version, and New International Version. The New Living Translation actually has the paraphrase, until the full number of Gentiles comes to Christ. In the Reformed tradition, this is taken to mean those individuals from the nations believed to be predestined to salvation. Sometimes this is connected with the massive people seen in Revelation 7:9, but more commonly, Luke 21:24. Jerusalem will be trampled down by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. World Messianic Bible. It is to be appropriately recognized that the best approach to what ta pleroma ton ethnon actually is, and this is something very, very few people actually do, will take into consideration the immediate previous usage of pleroma in Romans 11:12. So think about that for a moment. Pleroma, or fullness, used previously in Romans 11:12. Does that affect how pleroma is used in Romans 11:25? While to someone like me, that is the most logical approach to take regarding what pleroma means in Romans 11:25, the fullness of the nations, you will see many, many examiners, but most especially lay people, not investigate this. The Apostle Paul had just asked a direct question about the then present wide-scale Jewish rejection of Messiah Yeshua. If their trespass means riches for the world and their impoverishment means riches for the nations, how much more will their fullness mean? Romans 11:12, Kingdom New Testament. If the corporate rejection of the Jewish people to the Jewish Messiah will result in the world coming to a saving knowledge of him, how much more their fullness. Tree of Life version. Here, as noted, the term pleroma is best taken to mean that which is brought to fullness or completion from the BDAG lexicon. Now, you might want to go rewatch or re-listen to some of our examination, but as we previously examined, not all are agreed that pleroma in Romans 11:12 should be viewed in a quantitative sense, but instead a qualitative sense regarding what will happen when Israel proper recognizes its Messiah. Almost no major interpreter, though, takes pleroma in Romans 11:25 in a qualitative sense, although it is surely a legitimate exegetical option. If the immediate previous usage of pleroma in Romans 11:12 is taken into consideration regarding the spiritual fullness which the Jewish people are to have when they recognize Yeshua as the Messiah, then some kind of spiritual, ethical, and moral fullness, and likely also intellectual fullness, of those from the nations who have also acknowledged him can also be posited. This is, at least, partially observed in akri ou ta pleroma ton ethnon eselthe, being rendered as until the Gentile world enters in its fullness, Complete Jewish Bible, or until the Gentiles have been admitted in full strength, New English Bible. When ta pleroma ton ethnon, or the fullness of the nations, is approached from the perspective of fullness being qualitative, then the question of what the fullness is to regard or involved gets necessarily posed. It should be obvious that when Paul's letter was read to a mixed audience of people in Rome, that the Greek and Roman believers should have been stimulated to be fullness in the sense of wanting to better understand, appreciate, and integrate Paul's message. Textually speaking, being fullness, Romans 11:25, should involve being able and capable to understand the ramifications of what is stated in Romans 11:26 and 27, which we'll get to tomorrow. And as we should most especially think, and we'll discuss further, being fullness on the part of non-Jewish believers must involve understanding and implementing Paul's further word. For as you in time past were disobedient to God, but now have obtained mercy by their disobedience, even so these also have now been disobedient, that by the mercy shown to you, they may also obtain mercy. Romans 11:30 and 31, World Messianic Bible. The ancient first century challenge, which has widely persisted throughout the centuries, has been that far too many non-Jewish believers have not at all taken seriously Paul's word against being self-wise and self-concerned, much less being some sort of spiritual, ethical, and moral fullness when it comes to their relationship with the Jewish people. What if the fullness of the nations arriving on the scene of history does not involve some kind of predestined number of non-Jewish believers coming to salvation, or some other proposed group of people, but instead a spiritually mature group of believers from the nations who are grand vessels of mercy to the Jewish people? Consider how difficult it has been to see this manifested in human history, holding to the fullness of the nations entering in, because being a group of believers of an excelsior spiritual, ethical, and moral variety, and thus being the linchpin to bring about the full restoration of Israel's kingdom realm, consummating via the Messiah's arrival, Romans 11:26 and 27, is probably the most difficult interpretation. This view is not difficult because it accounts for how pleroma appears in either Romans 11:12 or 11:25. It is difficult because it challenges all of today's non-Jewish believers to evaluate whether or not they are truly demonstrating the mercy of Yeshua the Messiah and significant empathy and understanding toward their Jewish brothers and sisters. This involves, on the part of today's non-Jewish believers, a great deal of effort, spiritual, intellectual, and philosophical reasoning to strive to understand the Jewish struggle throughout history, as opposed to some of the arrogant and obnoxious trends which have been witnessed in recent years. Okay, so tomorrow we will be concluding our examination of Romans 9, 10, and 11, Romans 11, 26 through 36, which of course will take you to the end of chapter 11. So I know this study has been challenging for a lot of you, going through a lot of detail. We normally don't have studies like this on Messianic Insider. We try to keep things a little shorter, but time is of the essence, especially with what we see going on today. And unless we review a passage like Romans 9, 10, and 11, which so best encapsulates what the Messianic mission, what our salvation historical trajectory is, how are we going to be able to identify some of the false statements, false understandings, bad motives, in some cases demonic motives, which are out there in the world right now as it involves Israel and the Jewish people? Right, so let me switch screens back. And of course, this study has been taken from our ministry's commentary, Romans for the Practical Messianic. You can check it out as well as many other books and materials at messianictheology.store. All right. All right, so that concludes our theology roundup. Let's now move over to our news roundup. Now, we do the news roundup, of course, after the theology roundup because of the fact that news is time sensitive and it changes from day to day. So, for example, when people go to look at our ministry archives, they're going to be looking to this episode because of what we talked about regarding Romans 11, 22 through 25, not the news roundup, although some people might find it interesting. But the news roundup is important because there are a lot of things right now going on. I'm sorry to have to say this, but there are not a lot of people in the Messianic community who are making the effort to keep you up to date on more than just what's going on in Israel and the Middle East, what's going on in the world. And of course, we're reminded, number one, be praying for peace. Israel, Gaza, the Middle East, the Iranian situation. Number two, be praying for peace, Russia and Ukraine. And number three, be praying for reason and sanity to prevail here on the American home front and in the Western Hemisphere. So all the stories I'm about to go through, these are things which I encounter for the most part passively on social media, mainly X, Instagram, that sort of thing. And all the links will be available for you to look at later today when this episode is archived at messianicapologetics.net. Okay, our first story, and this is kind of interesting considering what we just reviewed regarding Romans 11:25, pleroma, non-Jewish believers being ethically, morally, intellectually, spiritually fullness, demonstrating God's love, God's mercy, God's grace to the Jewish people. Here's a post from yesterday by Dale Partridge. And he is a strong supporter of Christian nationalism, replacement theology, and he believes that in a Christian nation that Jewish synagogues would be illegal. He concludes, the Epstein files revealed that many of the world's most powerful elites are Christ-hating, Gentile-hating Jews. He concludes, noticing this isn't anti-Semitic. It's American Zionism finally dying because we're waking up to the truth. Judaism is not an ally of Christianity. Now, Dale Partridge, among others, does not demonstrate the same heartfelt burden that the Apostle Paul did in Romans chapter 11 toward his kinfolk who had widely dismissed Yeshua as Messiah. But it is true, whether we like it or not. And mind you, whether it's anti-Semitism, whether it's any one of these things we've been waiting to see hit, like the Epstein files, is going to come in waves. It was just a short year ago that things began being declassified. JFK, RFK, MLK, and now we've got Epstein. It's still going to take a while for people to sort through these materials, postulate certain conclusions, defend certain conclusions. It's far too premature to just assume, well, all these terrible Jewish elites are mentioned in the Epstein files, and then just kind of exclude all of the non-Jewish elites, which there are far, far more many of, who have done terrible things or apparently have done terrible things. So how many of these people, whether it's Calvin Robinson, we referred to yesterday, Dale Partridge, and they're going to be more, they're only looking at a small part. They're only looking at the parts of these materials which fit their narrative, which fit their conclusions, and they just ignore all these other people out there who are likely to be mentioned. So I think it's premature. Right now, we have to deal with things as they come, and they'll come in waves. But you all need to be aware of this. You know, Christian nationalism and its emphasis on, you know, in a Christian nation, it would be illegal for there to be a Jewish synagogue. That is the kind of position represented by a Dale Partridge, a Joel Webbin, whomever. And that is very concerning, and it should be very concerning for today's Messianic Jewish community. Now, we do need to fairly recognize that they're probably not really going to come into positions of power. The end time scenario is one of religious ecumenicism. All paths lead to God, not there's only the Christian nationalist path. All right, our next story. This is from yesterday, February the 2nd, from Israel. Excuse me, Inside Israel Intel, posted 11:20 a.m. But I got this after our episode yesterday. Israeli opposition leader Yair Lapid has expressed that the entire state of Israel is united against Iran after a security meeting with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. He noted that there are no disagreements on addressing the threat from Iran. So, and this is not the only source which picked this up, but it was the first one I saw. We're monitoring the Iranian situation right now. There's a huge amount of pressure on Benjamin Netanyahu, huge amount of pressure on President Trump. What's going to happen? What's not going to happen? And tension is building. Are we going to be seeing negotiations between the United States and Iran by the end of the week? There are a number of reports about that. Okay, from February the 2nd, I-24 News English. This is from 12:50 p.m. So this came out right before we started yesterday's live stream. So I didn't pick it up until afterward. There's a 1-minute, 47-second clip. Iranians are planning action. They are ready. The boots are already on the ground. Iranians are the boots and the front line in the fight against the Islamic Republic. So we need to be cautious when we talk about the Iranian situation, because there is the Islamic Republic of Iran, and then of course they're the people of Iran. The Islamic Republic of Iran is being opposed by many of the actual people of Iran. They're the ones, just like back in 1979 when the Shah was overthrown and he had to go into exile. The people of Iran have to see that the Islamic Republic is overthrown. That doesn't mean that they can't get help from Israel, the United States, and others. But unlike the 12-day war, when it was just a matter of bombing and taking out Iranian nuclear facilities, this is different. This is regime change on a massive scale. Open source intel, February the 2nd, posted 2:00 p.m. So after our show yesterday. Iran's leadership is increasingly worried a U.S. strike could break its grip on power by driving an already enraged public back onto the streets. Yes. So I am anticipating, although I don't want to speak presumptuous, but I'm anticipating, like so many people, that should the United States go and begin bombing, taking out particular targets in Iran, that is going to stimulate the people of Iran to finally do what they need to do, and that the Islamic Republic can come to an end. I think that's what a lot of us are waiting on, and there are a lot of different moving components in this. From Fox News yesterday, so let's move it back to North America, the United States. The Arc de Triomphe. President Trump is pushing plans for a massive triumphal arch in Washington, D.C., a project the White House says will become one of the most iconic landmarks in the world. And you see some pictures of this, supposed to be commemorative of the United States' 250th anniversary. Now, of course, throughout American history, new monuments have been commissioned and built in and around Washington, D.C. So having some kind of a victory arch in Washington, D.C., particularly to commemorate America's 250th anniversary since the Declaration of Independence, that's not surprising. Now, how many people will take this, people who follow the end times and prophecy, and then they connect it to Trump cutting all these peace deals and are going to use it to springboard onto the thought that, well, maybe Trump is setting the tone for the beast, or maybe Trump is the beast. We don't know. But do expect there to be at least some of that kind of speculation associated with a triumphal arch built by Trump, which of course connects to other triumphal arches seen, particularly in various, European cities, but ultimately goes back to the Roman Empire and the Caesars and everything else. So who knows what kind of speculation there might be. From open source intel, and there's a few paragraphs here, 3:04 p.m. Report, Israeli security sources told Walla News that Israel and the U.S. are operating at an unprecedented level of military coordination ahead of a possible large-scale strike on Iran, even as diplomatic feelers continue in parallel. And then, of course, there's more which is said there. So we know that U.S., Israeli military people, they've been meeting. Some of you all may have seen some of the posts going around with Dan Kane, who is the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He's been in Israel. So yeah, this is very serious. And while this kind of collaboration, coordination, talking, looking at different options is going on, yeah, there's also the parallel diplomatic track. What's going to happen there or not happen there? Okay, this is from Fox News yesterday, February the 2nd, 3:53 p.m., 46-second clip. President Trump. So this is Russia, Ukraine. I think we're doing very well with Ukraine and Russia. For the first time, I'm saying that. I think we're maybe going to have some good news. Now, we've got some more about the Russia-Ukraine situation. So is there actually going to be good news, or is that just a talking point from the president? Or is it good news as of yesterday afternoon? Okay, from Open Source Intel Defender, February the 2nd, 4:45 p.m. There are two paragraphs here. I'm not going to read it all, but Iran has informed the United States that it is willing to shut down or suspend its nuclear program in order to calm ongoing tensions in the Middle East, but that it would prefer a proposal made last year to create a regional consortium to produce nuclear power. American and Iranian officials have told the New York Times. And I got to be honest, when I first read that, I thought to myself, okay, so you're willing to give up some of your nuclear ambitions, but what we want is a regional consortium to produce nuclear power. And my initial response was, what a crock of blank. Because what it is like you really don't have the desire to be genuine aim to give up your nuclear ambitions. You really don't. Okay, so here's some speculation from open source intel posted 4:46 p.m. U.S. talks with Iran. U.S. to Iran. Are you ready to give up nuclear arms and terror? Iran, no. U.S. to Israel. It's go time. That is still how I see it playing out. Okay, so that's open source intel opinion about what could actually be taking place. Do we know if it's going to exactly take place that way? We do not. But we do know that a lot of the same things we saw last year are being repeated again to some extent this year. All right, back to the U.S. home front. This is going to be interesting because we got a series of posts regarding this. The New York Post, not the New York Times, yesterday, February the 2nd. This is from Instagram. Breaking: Bill Hillary Clinton to testify on Jeffrey Epstein relationship. Bill and Hillary Clinton caved Monday to House Oversight Committee Chairman James Comer's demand that they testify before the panel about their relationships with deceased pedophile Jeffrey Epstein and his convicted accomplice Ghislaine Maxwell. Okay, now we have another similar report. This is from Newsmax. This came up on my Instagram feed at almost the same time. Comer rejects Clinton's testimony offer in Epstein probe. Unreasonable offer. Representative James Comer, chairman of the House Oversight Committee, is rejecting what he calls a last-minute special treatment offer from Bill and Hillary Clinton to cooperate in the committee's Jeffrey Epstein investigation, just days before the House is expected to vote on holding them in criminal contempt of Congress. Okay. And we've got another story about this, so just hold your attention for a moment. Because normally we go through these stories as they come across my news feed, as I encounter them organically. Okay. From Iran International English, 2:12 p.m., February the 2nd. Iran rulers fear U.S. strike could reignite protests. Reuters. Iran's leadership is increasingly worried that a U.S. military strike could drive an already enraged public back onto the streets and threaten the survival of the Islamic Republic. Yes, and I know that many people right now are wondering, now, wait a second, did not the president say, didn't Trump say that help is on the way? And when is that going to happen? But how many things does the president, Prime Minister Netanyahu, others, how many things do they have to coordinate in order to finally possibly make their move? This is a little different than just going in and bombing Iranian nuclear facilities. This involves the people of Iran rising up against the Islamic Republic, while possibly Israel, the U.S., going in and taking out key sites, probably military sites, government sites in Iran, in order to give the people of Iran the necessary boost they need to get the job done. And what about the other world players, in particular, Russia, China, Qatar, Saudi Arabia? I mean, what about all these other players which need to be taken into consideration? Okay, back to the Clintons. Here's another one from Newsmax yesterday, February the 2nd. Clintons agree to testify in House Epstein probe. New. After initial refusals from the former president and first lady, Bill and Hillary Clinton have agreed to testify in a congressional investigation into the late sex offender Jeffrey Epstein. Okay, so this is where we pray every day for reason and sanity to prevail here on the American home front, because this is just unprecedented, whether you are left-wing, right-wing, centrist, whatever it is. A former president and first lady having to go before Congress to testify. And this is, of course, about this nasty Jeffrey Epstein business. What is going to happen? It's not going to be good. And of course, as I've said for a very long time, from the beginning, whatever's going to come out of the Epstein business, the normal citizens, faith and confidence in government, industry, entertainment, whatever it is going to plummet. Our faith and trust is in the God of the universe. Okay, here was an interesting story from Zero Hedge. I recommend that you look at it. It's from yesterday, February the 2nd. World's nuclear club will grow if U.S. doesn't act by Thursday, Medvedev warns. So this has to do with the new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, or the New START, and yeah, what's going to happen regarding the United States being involved. Now, President Trump is someone who does believe that the number of nuclear weapons in the world needs to be reduced, and he wants to cooperate, at least from what I've been able to see and hear. He wants to cooperate with Russia, also with China, to get the number of nuclear warheads greatly reduced. So what's going to happen? Is this just another talking point from the Kremlin? I don't know. But we do take those kinds of things into consideration, because that's the kind of stuff, as we look at what is going to happen in Iran, these are the other kinds of elements which, like, yeah, we live in this interconnected world. It's not just all about America or Israel. We got to factor in these other countries out there and what they could do, or at least threaten to do. All right, from 2C TV, this is from this morning, 3:09 a.m., 13-second clip. Chaos in West Tehran as Janat market is burning down. Early reports suggest anti-IRGC Iranians are behind recent sabotage operations. Yeah, so for example, over the weekend, many of you all saw images of what was taking place in Iran, these different gas explosions, and immediately people start thinking, oh, the Mossad did this. Yeah, but when you look back, it's like, no, the Mossad tends to be much more surgical and much more precise. Now, of course, it's entirely possible that with the infrastructure of Iran being what it is, that all of these explosions could have happened randomly on their own. But in all probability, this all came from resistance against the Islamic Republic. And you're going to see more and more of that. And as that kind of resistance builds, what's going to happen? Members of the Iranian military, they're going to see that the momentum is with the people who are rejecting the current regime, and they are going to put their support behind the people. That is what will typically happen. Okay. Our next story, this is from Visegrad 24. Speaking of the Russian situation, there's a 7-second clip. Russian forces deliberately struck Ukraine's energy infrastructure overnight as temperatures dropped to negative 25 degrees Celsius. So President Trump making the claim that, it appears things are going to work out okay with Russia, Ukraine. And then what does Russia do? They do this. So how serious is Russia regarding bringing this conflict to a conclusion? It's been over 4 years now. Okay, here's another one, Visegrad 24. Spain's government posted this morning, 4:31 a.m. Spain's government under far-left Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez wants to ban children and teenagers under 16 from accessing social media. And then you see Australia, France, and a number of countries are on the path to do so. And the conclusion of Visegrad 24 is, in reality, such bans only undermine online anonymity, as users must provide platforms with their IDs to access social media. Moreover, teenagers still find ways to bypass the restrictions using proxy services and VPNs. Okay, so generally speaking, I have to be honest, I don't believe a 15 or 16-year-old has any business, really being on social media. They should be outside, getting exercise. They should be in school, reading books, getting an education. They should be out in the workplace, having that first job. They don't need to be spending all their time on a Facebook or an X or an Instagram or whatever it is. So in principle, I don't have a problem with these kinds of laws. But what about, having to, present identification for every single thing you log into? And what about the different ways around this? So much of people spending an inordinate amount of time online does come down to how they're being raised. Young people, what the parents permit or do not permit. Uh, too much of our lives is controlled by electrical devices. I mean, we use them because we have, of course, a ministry outreach, but it's also true that, yeah, they extract a very high price socially from a lot of us. And um, I'll just conclude with, this won't be the last time we have to sort through some of the commentary people make on should 15, 16-year-olds be permitted to access uh, social media. But I know that a lot of people are concerned that it ultimately will involve, censorship of the internet, a tight control of the internet. I know that's what a lot of people are concerned about. Okay, here's one from Protestia from earlier today, 8:23 a.m. for the Catholic Prayer for America, March 19th, 2026, Washington, D.C. Protestia says, be there or be square. And of course, the conclusion, the concern people have regarding this is what? Now, you've got, I don't know who these three people are. I assume they're Catholic. We've got a father and a sister, a priest and a nun. I don't know who that is. General Michael Flynn. Many of us know who he is. Matt Walsh. Many of us know who he is. And look who else is attending. Candace Owens. So what does that say about Candace Owens? A lot of people are drawing some not so great conclusions about Candace Owens from that. Okay, three more stories. Okay, regarding the Iranian situation, open source Intel Defender, February the 3rd. Iran has demanded changes to the venue and format for negotiations with the United States this Friday, potentially putting the talks at risk of collapse. Two sources with knowledge of the situation tell Axios. Okay, so we heard that, okay, they're going to be negotiations with Iran probably by Friday, but we don't like the format. We don't like the venue. Okay, well, how serious are you? Or are you just buying time to do something? Or what is this all about? All right, two more posts. This is from 2CTV. And they have a link to YouTube. Breaking U.S. and IRGC clash erupts. U.S. Navy shoots down Iranian drone. And this was the first story I saw, but it was definitely picked up by other venues. Okay, so we've got, of course, the Abraham Lincoln Task Group, in and around the Gulf of Oman. It's in the backyard of Iran, and shoots down an Iranian drone. Now, that's not like shooting down an Iranian Air Force jet. Is not like, firing at another ship, but pay attention to that kind of thing. Okay, and then finally, and this is a number of posts from Open Source Intel Defender today, 10:08 a.m. So here you see basically a reference to, in the past week or so, a number of Israeli defense and intelligence officials have visited Washington. But now, a couple hours later, three of President Trump's advisors all told Axios they think launching a military option now against Iran wouldn't be the right way to go. Okay. This is, of course, a situation which is changing day by day. We don't know what's going to happen next, but we do know for certain that tensions are on the rise. Will there be a diplomatic meeting between U.S. and Iranian officials, or is that going to fall through? What military options are Israel, the United States considering? Pray for peace in the Middle East right now. And I know that a lot of us are very concerned about what we see possibly occurring. But one of the things which does rather strike me is how many are there out there? And mind you, I don't want to speak universally, but a month ago, uh, we were attending the IMCS Rabbis Conference in Orlando, Florida. And yes, there were some people who were talking about current events and what's going on, the rising anti-Semitism and what have you, but it was not mentioned enough. It was not mentioned enough. And when you go to your Messianic congregation or synagogue this Shabbat, and there is some kind of a prayer issued for Israel, for the world, whatever it is, are you going to have somebody pray for, Lord, we pray for the Iranian situation. We pray for the believers in Iran, in the Middle East, the Messianic Jewish believers in Israel, see that they are protected. Give world leaders like Netanyahu and Trump wisdom to know what to do and what not to do. And give us wisdom and discernment to know when we are in human history so that we can properly do your kingdom work as we anticipate the return of your Son. How much of that kind of a prayer are you actually going to begin hearing more and more frequently in the Messianic experience? I don't know. And I don't have the kind of confidence as I once did 10 years ago or 20 years ago. I just don't have that kind of confidence anymore. I think Messianic leaders are more concerned about what's in their immediate window of influence, not regarding when we are, where we are, and where we are going. But I think we still have time to make necessary course corrections, to recalibrate what we need to recalibrate, to fix what we need to fix. Not all hope is lost, but with a ministry like ours, in some ways, we're not a voice in the wilderness, but in some ways we are. So, as always, on behalf of Messianic Apologetics, I would like to sincerely thank you for your ongoing prayers, encouragement, and support for all of our ministry efforts. And as we are now in calendar year 2026, please do consider signing up for a monthly donation, $25, $50 a month. It will go far and it will be used wisely. If you haven't, please do visit my website, messianicapologetics.net, where you can access a wide array of articles, frequently asked questions, entries, back issues of Outreach Israel News, back episodes of Messianic Insider, different McKee moment shorts, and generally, you can take a look at our ministry adventures over the years. And please do be sure to give this episode a thumbs up or a heart. It will help our exposure on social media. We will see you again tomorrow with another episode of Messianic Insider. Until then, may God bless you, shalom, and take care.